Hey guys, in this video, we're gonna see if the Dell G5 pre-built desktop gaming PC is worth your money. I'll be answering many questions like, can you mine with this and pay off the entire PC? How are the thermals, the noise levels, and the overall performance while gaming and doing productivity tasks? We'll also discuss what upgrades you should pick prior to ordering this computer and what upgrades you should definitely do after you receive this computer. So some of the big tech YouTubers like Gamers Nexus and David Does Tech Stuff have reviewed Dell's pre-built gaming PCs like the G5, XPS, and Alienware. And they all poked a lot of fun at these pre-built PCs. Now, choosing the cheapest spec version of any PC, tearing it down and critiquing it makes for really good entertainment for the masses, but I find it mildly annoying when these elitist video reviews aren't really being very productive to the broad consumer. We're faced with a shortage of graphics cards thanks to the scalpers, GPU miners, and bots that buy out all the inventory. So regular people like myself are being forced to buy these pre-built PCs so that they can continue to be productive and, of course, game. In this video, instead of bashing Dell for putting crappy CPU coolers into their PCs or loading up with bloatware, I'll share my actual experience speccing out a decent version of the Dell G5 and share my thoughts of how I think you can make the best of the situation. Let's get right into it.
So the first thing I want to talk about is my specific configuration, and this is what happens when you pick your Dell computer and you just customize it as you wish. The first thing is the CPU chip. Now I opted for the Intel i7-10700KF series, and I'm going to explain what the K and the F actually means. I'm going to give you a primer on that. The K means that the CPU chip is slightly higher at a base clock speed, and it also means that it's unlocked. This means that you can overclock it. Now, unfortunately, with the Dell G5, overclocking is near to impossible, especially given that the current motherboard. Overclocking really heavily depends on the type of motherboard you have. This allows it to actually overclock, and if you have a really crappy motherboard like the one that's in the Dell computer, you probably won't get a lot of benefit for getting the K series. However, there are some significant benefits if you do opt to upgrade to the K version. The first is that you're going to get a substantially way better CPU cooler. And as you can see in this picture over here, it has a really large radiator with all these aluminum fins. And then there are heat pipes that allow the heat to be dissipated a lot faster. This is the main reason why you may want to get a K processor. Another bonus is that they add a VRAM heatsink, which is something that you would have to usually go out and buy on eBay. And for people in Canada, it's really cheap. The actual component is really cheap, but it can be a hassle to get because A, it's going to take a long time to deliver, and B, there's always a lot of shipping fees and maybe a currency conversion. So in the end, paying that extra 100 Canadian dollars, or in US dollars, about 80 US dollars to upgrade to the K CPU is a decent upgrade.
In fact, if you're not planning to do any aftermarket CPU cooler upgrades, the $100 Canadian price difference to upgrade on Dell's website is not a bad deal in the end. Here's the breakdown. Let's say you went to a retail store, let's say Canada Computers, and wanted to buy the K variant of the Intel chip at retail price. The price difference is about 7 Canadian dollars. Then you consider the cost of upgrading your CPU cooler from eBay, since in Canada, at least, it's very hard to get the Dell OEM premium cooler from their website. So the price difference can be quite expensive. You may be paying up to 40 to 80 Canadian dollars just to get the premium Dell OEM cooler. Additionally, if you do end up upgrading to the K version of the CPU chip, Dell throws in a complimentary VRAM heatsink on your motherboard, and that normally would cost anywhere to $20 to $30, especially for people in Canada. So all in all, it's actually a pretty good deal to get the K version and just pay the $100 premium on Dell's website. As you can see, you can save about $60 if you really value the K version from the non-K version. Of course, it's going to be a stock performance boost. You're not going to be able to overclock it, but maybe one day you can take that K chip, put it in a different motherboard, and overclock the heck out of it.
So you might have seen my previous video where I covered this in a lot of great detail, and I advise a lot of people to get the K version. However, I'm going to retract that recommendation. I think getting the non-K version is totally fine because you can do an aftermarket cooler upgrade, which I will also make a separate video about, but I'll briefly explain this later in the video. And that actually may be the better route because one, you're going to save some money because who needs the K version if you can't overclock? And the base clock difference is pretty subtle in that regard in terms of performance. So maybe you can just save money and just get the non-K version. In the end, it's really up to your preference. If you don't want to do any upgrades, I would get the K version. If you want to do some CPU cooler upgrades and you don't mind doing thermal paste and removing it and buying these specific screws and getting a specific type of cooler, then that route is probably going to be a lot better. So let's talk about the F letter and the CPU chip. Unfortunately, there's no way to get a non-F version. The F version means of any Intel chip is that there's no integrated graphics GPU on the actual CPU chip. And this is one of the things that I was really despised about Dell. In previous Dell machines, you were able to get the non-F version, which would actually give you an onboard GPU. So that would be very helpful to debug issues with your graphics card. Ironically, in my case, I wanted to debug something with my 3060 Ti that's on my Dell G5. It's kind of making some weird coil whine, and I want to find out what is the source of this noise, and not being able to just rip out the graphics card, turn on the integrated graphics chip on the Intel CPU chip, and then debug the issue so I can isolate the noise would be very handy. Unfortunately, Dell does not allow you to upgrade, and I think this is a really sad loss for a lot of people. But for most people, this is probably not going to be a big deal. So you're going to get an F version no matter what. I noticed a lot of people are buying Dell G5s just for the graphics card. So what ends up happening is they get a really cheap, low spec PC, so like a 10400F and 8 gigs of RAM for whatever. And then they try to get a really expensive graphics card. But what ends up happening with the price is that I think Dell has caught on to this, and they made the price a lot more expensive even if you get a low spec PC. So in the end, I still think it's worth it just to get a 10700F, like a decent CPU, and you still get your graphics card. And you don't pay that much extra, but you get a substantially better CPU in the end. So let's talk about the RAM configuration. Now, I personally needed 32 gigs of RAM. This is very essential for 4K editing. Going from 16 gigs to 32 gigs of memory for video editing in 4K in Adobe Premiere is a substantial boost in productivity. I also noticed that this is very helpful if you're running multiple Chrome applications and let's say you're doing programming and you're building a project. Just having that extra memory, 32 gigs, is the sweet spot, and I think it's quite essential, especially in 2021, to have 32 gigs. Now, if you're just a pure hardcore gamer, 16 gigs is going to be more than sufficient, and there's plenty of videos that prove this. But personally, I needed 32 gigs. Now, you might be laughing at me saying, oh, why did you upgrade from 16 to 32 gigs? You could have just went to a store and bought a cheaper RAM module. Now, here's the thing with Dell. They use a lot of proprietary parts, and sometimes it's very difficult to get the same RAM module. Now, this RAM module, you can see what its manufacturer is rated at 2933 megahertz. And I find it that it's very difficult, or at least risky, to go out and say maybe $15 to buy your own 16 gig RAM module and then install it, and maybe there's some compatibility issues. And this is especially true if you're trying to couple a Dell RAM module, let's say 1 by 16 gigabytes, with your own 1 by 16 gigabyte RAM module stick. I don't really like that. I don't trust me finding the proper RAM module, so I'd much rather just pay the little bit of premium and get 32 gigs RAM. Now, this is a matter of personal preference, how much memory you have, but make sure you get the dual channel if you end up not upgrading. If you just end up getting 1 by 16 or 1 by 8, you're going to sacrifice a lot of performance. And upgrading to a dual channel is no extra cost in the pre-configuration phase when you buy your Dell computer. What I find really funny about these big tech YouTubers is that when they pick their pre-built PC from Dell, they always end up getting a single channel memory. And I was like, who the heck is going to be doing that? Like that is such a conceited type of scenario. And I think it's really silly that they say, oh, the PC is crappy because it comes with one stick of memory. Like, of course, no one's going to be doing that. I don't understand why they're making this type of content in the end. Now, if you look at the RAM modules, it's rated at 3200, but unfortunately, given the motherboard and the processor, you're still stuck at 2933 megahertz in terms of the speed of the memory. And you can't overclock that, unfortunately, because of the limitations of the motherboard. Another crappy thing with all Dell computers is that they never put any RAM heatsinks, and I'm not sure how essential having a RAM heatsink is. So let me know in the comment section below, if I put a RAM module heatsink, will that actually help in terms of the thermals and the performance and the stability of this system? So far, I have had no issues. So for the hard drive configuration, I got a 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD drive. And I think that's more than sufficient for just a kind of a boot drive. Obviously, I added a 500 gigabyte Western Digital drive just so I can put my games and video editing and a scratch disk on it. Like I mentioned in my previous video, I highly recommend to not get a 3.5-inch hard disk drive because, first of all, they're really slow, but most importantly, they're going to block a potential place to put a 120 millimeter intake fan. And you can actually do a 3D printed part, which would make it really easy to install that. I'm going to talk about that later in the video, how you can just simply put a 120 millimeter intake fan, and it's going to really improve the airflow and just give you much better performance and much better sound levels. So if you can, try to opt out from getting any hard disk drive that will block the intake fan place. So the next upgrade is a little bit controversial because it's really difficult to prove if it's worth it, but it's really cheap. And so it's like $20. And that's upgrading from Wi-Fi 5 to Wi-Fi 6. And this is the killer Wi-Fi module. Now, personally for me, competitive CS:GO is something that I like to play a lot in my pastime, and having low latency is essential. And being able to download large files over the Wi-Fi network is also very important because obviously I'm uploading large gigabytes to YouTube and whatnot. Now, the issue with my room specifically is that I don't have access to an Ethernet gigabit port, so I don't have access to a cable, so I need to rely on Wi-Fi, which is really unfortunate. But if you're in a scenario where you can reliably have an Ethernet connection, a cabled connection, this upgrade is totally not necessary. But if you really need to use Wi-Fi, it is a good, I think it's a decent upgrade. And I've seen a lot of YouTube videos where they show that there's a substantial increase from going to, Wi-Fi 5 module to a Wi-Fi 6 module. You're going to get better speeds and better latency. So let's talk about the power supply unit. Now this one is a 500 watt Platinum 80 plus rated power supply, and this is the biggest one you can possibly get. There's only two versions, the 350 watt version and the 500 watt. If you get a fast graphics card, you're definitely going to need the 500 watt power supply. The second thing about this power supply is that it is proprietary, it's not modular, and it's just very weird overall. Gamers Next just did a good job about explaining how this power supply is really lacking. If you know how to replace this power supply, please let me know in the comment section down below. I've done my research, I couldn't find anything conclusive, and it really sucks. I think this is one of the main reasons why upgradeability of this Dell PC is very limited, and it has to do with the power supply. Now, in terms of the GPU or the graphics card, I do recommend getting the 3060 Ti. I think it's one of the best price to performance ratio type of graphics cards that are out there. It has the same hash rate as the 3070, but uses less power. So if you're into GPU mining, that's probably a really good thing. In terms of gaming performance, it is slightly less than a 3070. However, it's substantially cheaper. So that's where the price to performance ratio comes in. And for the final upgrade that I made to the Dell G5 was to get a clear case. Now, this is a matter of personal preference. This has to do with aesthetics and the way it looks and the RGB lighting and all that. Throughout my whole career of gaming for 20 years, I've never owned a PC with a clear case, and I've always wished that I purchased one. I don't know why I never did. It's kind of silly in retrospect, but being able to see into my case and see the components working, the fans spinning, the lights, and just making sure everything's working fine without having to unscrew the case all the time, I think there's some actually benefit to it. Now, a lot of people are ridiculing people getting this Dell G5 with clear case because inside the components, they look very ugly. They're not very pretty, but I find that kind of silly, a little elitist, to be honest. Being able to see inside, like I said, has some value because you can see things are working properly. You can see it's becoming dusty, so you can clean it. So there is a lot of value to having a clear case in terms of your PC maintenance. But I did find it actually pretty attractive. Now, obviously this is very subjective, but having that RGB light and then seeing that really cool big radiator or the CPU cooler kind of just do its job, and then the RTX logo or the GeForce logo lighting up, I think that all looks really cool and very gamery. So I personally really like this. I think it's a really cheap upgrade. I think it's about 50 Canadian dollars, which is 40 US dollars. So it's not that bad, but obviously people are laughing at the PCB color of the motherboard, and the components inside look really cheap, and there's no, for example, on the memory module, there's no cool RGB lighting, for example. So yeah, this is a matter of personal preference, but I personally liked it. So for the next section of this video, I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Dell G5. Now, personally for me, I really like the computer. I think it's a decent computer, especially for the price and given the times that we're in. But there are some major issues, and I want to get to that a little bit later in the video. First, I want to talk about some of the positives so it's not all bleak and kind of sad. The first thing I want to say is I really like the form factor of the actual case. A lot of people, like I said, make fun of it. It looks funny. It's a Dell computer, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, whatever. I actually really like the small footprint it has. And I think this is one major benefit to having such a small case is that if you're in a tight room or a tight space and you don't have a lot of space, obviously, having a smaller case is very beneficial. And of course, I like the clear case, as I mentioned before. So the small form factor is really cute, but also it doesn't look too kind of ugly, doesn't look too professional. It does look pretty gamery, but still has a very sleek look. So I really like it. Now, the good thing about the case is that there's some decent airflow. Everything is perforated in the front, so you can technically put some fans, two fans at the front, and then have air sucked in and air blown out. I'm going to do a separate video on how you can mod the entire case so you can add two extra fans at the front and put a better fan at the back. One minor con for this G5 case is that it is not elevated, so there's no airflow below it. The Alienware case has this feature. I'm not sure how important it is to have it elevated, but I'll be using a cheap Amazon riser pad to help with airflow. I'll put in a link in the description for it. Now, in terms of just using the computer, the usability, the speed of it, I'm very impressed. I really like how snappy everything is. Thankfully, upgrading from my Mac, which was really slow, the MacBook Pro 16-inch, being able to transition over to a PC just feels a lot better. Everything is just so much better, so much faster. And of course, I can actually game on this and do serious video editing. So the SSD performs very well. It's fast enough for my needs. And the CPU is really fast and snappy. So looking at some synthetic benchmarks, a 3D Mark, you can see that the processor is doing a lot better than my old 8700K processor on my Dell Alienware Aurora R7. And you can see that the graphics card is slightly less performant than the RTX 3070, but still doing pretty well. So overall, it's a decent computer. It's very fast. It's going to be a major upgrade from any laptop. And if you're having a computer in the past 5 years, it's definitely going to be a good upgrade. Now let's talk about the bad section, or more of this is kind of nitpicks or annoyances. The first one I want to mention is that there's no USB-C port in the rear panel. It's only at the front panel, which kind of sucks, especially if you want to mount something that is more modern. You know, it does have the new USB 3.0 ports. There's like 4 of them over there, but it would have been nice to have a USB-C input. Now, more annoyingly is when I'm using the mouse and I'm kind of just moving the mouse around, you can hear a slight coil whine. Now, I have very sensitive hearing. I can hear a lot of, especially high pitch or high frequency types of noises. They're very annoying for me, especially in a quiet environment. And every time I move my mouse, I can hear it, and I'm not sure what it is. I would have loved to be able to debug this if I had the non-F version of an Intel chip, so I could remove the graphics cards and see where the actual coil whine is coming, because I suspect it's coming from the graphics card, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So another weird annoyance has to do with the power supply. If you turn off the Dell G5 and keep it plugged into the wall outlet, you can actually hear the power supply clicking. It's making this weird clicking noise. And I'm not sure if that's anything concerning, if there's any defect to my particular power supply unit, but it doesn't sound very safe at all. So I'm kind of concerned about leaving this plugged in all the time. Now the clicking is not very audible. Obviously you can't hear it from afar, but if you put your ear very close to it, you can hear it. So let me know in the comment section if you experience the same behavior. So another minor annoyance is upgradeability. The first thing I want to say is that the power supply is very hard to upgrade since it's so proprietary. Dell in fact uses a lot of proprietary components, so just upgrading in general is very limiting. Given the small form factor of the case, you can't put a CPU all-in-one water cooler inside. You have to stick to kind of taller heatsinks, and I'll go over through a list of all the possible heatsinks in a separate video of what you can upgrade to, but unfortunately the upgradability is very limited in that regard. Another annoyance is all the bloatware and all the Dell software that comes preloaded into this computer. Now, of course, you can just put a new boot drive and then reload Windows, but for me personally, that seems to be a lot of work, because as soon as I get this computer, I just want to start setting it up. I don't want to have to go through all this process. So I'm going to live with the bloatware. I actually did it with the R7. I have all the bloatware on it, and it hasn't really impacted the performance. I haven't noticed anything. You'll get the occasional update reminder, which can be very annoying, and there's potentially ways to disable it. But yeah, this one, the Dell G5, has McAfee and has all this preloaded software, and it can be very annoying. So you have to manually go in and delete it all. The one thing I'm concerned, if you clear out your SSD drive and install a fresh copy of Windows, is how exactly are you going to transfer the license from the Dell's Windows license to your own copy of Windows? If anyone can answer this, please let me know in the comment section down below. Okay, so let's get into the ugly section. And this is the part where I kind of rip into Dell's G5 and kind of really complain about some of the major annoyances, more problematic issues that I've had using the Dell G5. Now, the first one has to do with the CPU cooler. Now, I obviously got the K variant of the Intel chip, which gives me the better CPU cooler. Now, unfortunately, after doing a lot of research, I found out that the CPU cooler that's included with the K version, the tall radiator, is not very good at all. And the reason why, mainly from my personal perspective, is that it uses a really cheap fan that's embedded in the coil fins. That fan, for some reason, the ball bearing in it is just very noisy, especially at a low RPM. So the actual fan isn't very loud. It's not like humming like very loud. In fact, I much prefer a low frequency hum, like kind of like a typical fan would do. But just, you kind of hear like a high frequency type of, I don't know, just like a spin. Now, I've asked other people and they found no issues with it. So your mileage may vary, and this may not even be a concern for you, but I'm just very annoyed by the littlest kind of high frequency noise, and being able to hear the fan, especially when it operates at a low RPM, is just very unfortunate because I paid so much more money to upgrade my CPU cooler to the better version, and I still have to go out and replace it with an aftermarket cooler. So I have to go through all the research of learning how to upgrade it, buying the special screws and whatnot, which I'll talk about later in this video.
I want to mention one big disclaimer. Even though I'm utterly disappointed with the upgraded premium fan cooler from Dell, it's still a substantial upgrade from the cheap stock cooler you get with the non-K Intel chip variant. If you're not comfortable modding your PC, I still recommend this Dell premium cooler, but getting for example, a Noctua NH-U9S has been proven by David Does Tech Stuff to be a lot quieter and perform a lot better. I'll put a link to this video in the description down below.
The next major con for this is the coil whine. Now, I mentioned it in the kind of the bad section or the annoyances, but the coil whine is more prevalent if let's say you're using the graphics card more intensely. Now, I'm doing some GPU mining using a NiceHash. I made a whole video on how you can kind of pay back your computer just through GPU mining. Check it out in the link description. But anyways, when I'm mining, I kind of hear a high frequency noise, and that also is very annoying. It's kind of like a coil whine, and I'm not sure if it's coming from the motherboard. It's kind of similar to what happens when the mouse moves and you can hear the coil whine. So it's kind of somehow related to the graphics card, and I would love to debug this, but I don't have an integrated graphics card onto the CPU chip, so I could just remove the graphics card and actually isolate the noise. So I was able to do a direct comparison of the Dell 3060 Ti with my Founders Edition RTX 3070, and what I noticed with the 3070 is that it's substantially quieter. It's just the fans don't ramp up as loud, especially when GPU mining or playing video games. So substantially quieter. It is a lot cooler. So the thermal performance on the Founders Edition 3070 Ti, even though it's a more intense graphics card, uses more power, it's a lot cooler. So I'm not sure what is up with this 3060 Ti. And the worst part about the 3060 Ti is that the actual exhaust for the blower portion of this graphics card is blocked off. So all the hot air just gets recirculated into the case, and it has to be exhausted out a different way. So I don't know why the plastic shroud of the graphics card is actually blocking the external exhaust. And this is very odd because if you look at the RTX 3070, it actually has a proper setup where the fan actually blows hot air through the exhaust through the rear panel of your case, so you can actually get better airflow. I'm not sure why this 3060 Ti purposely blocks the airflow. So it's just overall, it's going to make your CPU a lot hotter inside, and it's obviously going to affect your graphics card performance. Now, one interesting thing is that the GPU, while idle below 50 Celsius, the fans do not spin at all. So in that case, it is quiet while idle, but I did notice that when I'm using the graphics card, it is louder. The fans do ramp up a lot faster than the RTX 3070 Founders Edition. The final major disappointment with my Dell G5 is that, unlike my Alienware, there's no one-click overclock option. As you can see, it's disabled in the Alienware control center. As a noob PC gamer, I much prefer a simple way to overclock my CPU, especially if I paid $80 extra for the K-Unlock Intel chip. If you know how to overclock the Dell G5 from the BIOS, please let me know in the comment section. This could be a hard limitation from the crappy motherboard that is used. A good example of how the motherboard limits you is that you can't remove the turbo boost time limit. So in the end, I'm concerned about the coil whine, the power supply, the graphics card, the lack of blower exhaust, how hot it gets. Just overall, the CPU cooler, the upgraded version is noisier. It's not that great. I still have to do an aftermarket cooler upgrade. There's just overall a lot of things that need to be done in order to get this computer at peak performance. I'm also going to be adding 2 front intake fans and replacing the really crappy Dell 80 millimeter rear fan, which is so tiny it does basically nothing, moves no air. So there's a lot of upgrades, and it's going to go anywhere from $100 to $200 if you're going to upgrade everything. And so that is the added cost when you get this computer, and something that is hidden in the cost when you actually purchase it. Now I want to mention one major caveat for all of this. If you're a simple user and you don't have that OCD that I have, you don't care about maybe some of the higher noise levels, which for a regular person I think is pretty reasonable, you probably don't need to do any of these upgrades, and you can just get the K version of the CPU chip and you're going to be totally fine. I'm just very picky. I'm just trying to, I'm trying to hone in on all these issues. I'm acutely aware of all of them. So for regular users, if you're not aware of this, you're totally going to be fine. So let's quickly talk about GPU mining. Now, compared to my RTX 3070 Founders Edition in my Dell Alienware Aurora R7, unfortunately, it's obviously not as good as that. The Dell G5 runs hotter, so it has a much greater temperature in terms of everything, the CPU and the actual 3060 Ti graphics card. And it also runs much louder, much louder. This one over here, the Dell Alienware R7, is just way cooler, and it runs way smoother, just less noise overall. So it's kind of unfortunate how different they are. And worst of all, if you're going to be applying a overclock, and this is what NiceHash provides, there's three different levels of overclock. There's the light, there's the medium, and there's the high. My Dell R7, Aurora R7 with the RTX 3070 Ti can be overclocked to high with no issues, no like loud fans or anything like that. With the Dell G5 with the RTX 3060 Ti, it is extremely loud if you use the high setting when you use the high overclock. I actually have to keep it at light for it to be reasonably quiet, because I'm not sure why. Maybe it's not overclocking just as well as the RTX 3070.
Let's do a price comparison between what you'd pay to buy a similarly spec'd PC at retail prices versus the Dell price. Now, these prices were recorded in May 2021, and the crypto bear market has already started, but scalpers and GPU miners have not flooded the GPU market yet. Bear in mind that all the prices you see are in Canadian dollars. Now, one note about the hardware components. I believe even if you went out and bought the cheapest hardware components, say for the motherboard, the RAM, the case, for example, you'd still end up with a much better PC build in the end. So it's really hard to compare the retail hardware components to Dell's components price per price, but we'll try our best. Doing my research on how to cheaply obtain a Windows 10 license key, it is very confusing. Some say you pay $30, some say it's free, some say it's $150. So I'm not really sure. I just put $30 in that case that you build your own PC. Now, the GPU cost is also very highly controversial. Retailers like Newegg and Canada Computers were not selling GPUs at MSRP prices. As you can see in the diagram, even with the 10% newsletter Dell promo code, I still paid an extra $77. Due to the rapid inflation, the $750 cost of the 3060 Ti was actually the average retail price if you were lucky enough to get the chance to buy one. Realistically, you would have to go out and pay scalpers on the secondary market like Craigslist, which ranged anywhere from the low end of $1,300 all the way to $1,600 for just the 3060 Ti. In the second scenario, where you paid the current cheapest scalper fee, you actually saved around $470. So in the end, depending on how you look at it, the Dell PC is a fair deal.
So in conclusion, let's wrap this up. As a Dell customer, I'm kind of dissatisfied with their customer service. They rejected my request for a refund. They were very slow to answer my questions, and the shipping of this computer took a long time, 30 days. So the overall customer experience is going to be pretty bad overall. Now, unfortunately, we're faced with a situation where we have kind of no choice, and it's, beggars can't be choosers. We just need, if I really need a graphics card, if I really need a computer, I'm going to have to put up with all this kind of subpar user experience and, of course, customer experience. Now, for the actual hardware, the product that you get in the end, it does fulfill its need, which is to provide gaming experiences and productivity, and it does work. It's a lot faster than any laptop I've had, and it performs pretty well, except of course compared to some your own pre-built PC or even an Alienware, it's going to run hotter, it's going to run louder, and you have to do a lot of aftermarket upgrades in order to get the best performance, the best thermals, and the best noise levels. Anyways, I hope me going over each line by line item of the configuration will help you make your right choice. I do recommend using promo codes and any Rakuten cashback. I'll put a link in the description for my Rakuten cashback referral link, which will save you some money in the end. So definitely use your promo code so that you get the best price possible and wait for any deals. Also, if you have any questions about the Dell G5, I'm very happy to answer. I'll be making a separate video on how to upgrade the CPU cooler with a Noctua heatsink fan, and of course, upgrade all the fans so that you have better airflow in the case. Thanks for watching. Stay subscribed for that video, and I'll see you in the next video.